The holding bay smelled like recycled air and old humiliation. I had been standing in it for 3 hours. My boots were polished, my uniform was pressed, my face was completely still. That was the job. That was always the job. Sergeant Mara Voss of the United Earth Diplomatic Escort Corps did not fidget. She did not complain. She stood at the door of whatever room she was told to stand at, and she waited, and she smiled when she had to, and she did not let anything show. The Velarath guard at the far end of the corridor had not looked at me once. He had not looked at any of the 6 humans waiting in that bay. We were furniture to him. We were less than furniture. Furniture, at least, he might have found useful. Ambassador Colin Price sat on the bench beside me. He was 61 years old. He had spent 30 years in Earth's diplomatic service. He had negotiated water-sharing agreements between nations that had gone to conflict over rivers. He had brokered 3 separate ceasefire arrangements in regions where people had been dying for decades. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the finest minds Earth had ever sent into a room with difficult people. He had a folded piece of paper on his knee. He kept smoothing it with his thumb, not reading it, just smoothing it, over and over, like he was trying to keep his hands busy so the rest of him could stay calm. They said 20 minutes, he told me quietly. I know, I said. That was 2.5 hours ago. I know, sir. He looked at the paper, smoothed it again. This is the 15th time, he said, not angry, not even frustrated anymore, just stating it, the way you would state a fact about weather. 15 delegations, 40 years of summits, and we still sit in the waiting room. I did not answer, because there was no answer that would have helped him. The Galactic Accord had welcomed humanity with great ceremony 40 years ago. There had been broadcasts, there had been speeches. The Secretary General had wept on live television when the first Accord vessel broke through the clouds over Geneva and landed in the Lake District, its hull catching the morning light like something out of a dream. Every child on Earth had watched it. I had watched it. I was 4 years old, and I had pressed my nose against the living room screen and thought, this is the beginning of everything. What followed was something much quieter and much more complicated. The Accord was not a partnership. It presented itself as one, but it was not. It was a hierarchy with better manners than most. At the top sat the Velarath and their close allies, the Cenari and the Golkeith. Below them were the mid-tier species, the ones who had been in the Accord long enough to earn real trade access and real votes in council proceedings. And at the bottom, newly admitted, still learning, still watched, still managed like a child who had only just been allowed to sit at the adult table, were humans. We paid our Accord dues. We followed the technology transfer restrictions, which meant we could buy certain systems from Accord suppliers at prices that kept us permanently dependent, but could not develop our own without approval from a licensing board that had never once approved a human application. We sent our diplomats to every summit, every session, every ceremonial gathering, and our diplomats sat where they were told to sit and spoke when they were told to speak. And we smiled. We were very good at smiling. I had been doing this for 11 years. Before I was assigned to diplomatic escort, I had served 6 years in the Earth Defense Force, which was technically called a defense force but was, in practical terms, a small collection of older ships equipped with technology the Accord had cleared for human use, which meant technology that was, at minimum, 2 full generations behind whatever was currently flying in Accord space. We were not a threat to anyone. We were not supposed to be. The door opened. A Velarath junior official stepped through. He was tall, as they all were, with that particular stillness they carried in their bodies that I had learned, over years, was not calm. It was disdain. They moved slowly around humans, because they did not consider us worth moving quickly for. The council is ready, he said. He did not apologize for the wait. He did not acknowledge it had happened. Ambassador Price stood, tucked the paper into his jacket, and straightened his collar. He was 61 years old, and he had the back of a man who had never once let himself slouch in a room where it mattered. Thank you, he said to the Velarath official, with complete sincerity. I followed them through the corridor into the main chamber. It was enormous, the way all Accord spaces were enormous, built for the comfort of species that were taller and broader than humans, filled with that particular pale light that the Velarath preferred, and that always made me feel like I was standing inside a cloud. The great table at the center of the room was a smooth arc of material that I had never been able to name, something that was not quite stone and not quite metal, and around it sat representatives of 16 species. There were no empty chairs on the human side of the table. Price stopped walking. Just for a moment. Just a half-second pause that no one in that room would have noticed unless they had been watching him as closely as I had been watching him for 3 years. Then he walked to the wall, where a small secondary table had been placed, and he sat down at it, and he opened his folder, and he began to review his notes. He had been denied a seat at the main table. Again. I stood at my post near the door, and I watched him sit at that small table and prepare himself to speak for the people of Earth. And I kept my face completely still, and I thought about a word that I had not let myself think in 11 years of this work. Enough. I did not say it. I pressed it down, the way I always pressed it down, and I stood straight, and I watched the chamber fill with the soft sounds of diplomacy. But the word sat in the back of my mind like a stone, and it was heavier than it had ever been before. That evening, on the orbital transport back to Seoul Station Meridian, Price sat across from me and looked out the narrow viewport at the stars. His folder was closed on the table beside him. He had given his address from the small table at the wall. He had been articulate and prepared, and he had been thanked briefly, and his points had been noted for the record. "Do you know what they discussed after our portion?" he asked. I did not. The redistribution of 3 inhabited systems in the Keth corridor. Resources, trade lanes, settlement rights. Hundreds of thousands of people affected. He paused. They asked us to wait outside for that part. We sat in silence for a while. The stars moved past the viewport, steady and cold and enormous. "There are people back home," Price said, "who have been asking questions, quiet questions, through quiet channels, about whether the restrictions we operate under are what they claim to be." He looked at me. "Whether the Technology Licensing Board has been doing something more deliberate than bureaucracy." I kept my expression neutral, but something shifted in my chest. "The kind of questions," he continued, "that if the answers are what some people believe they are, would change everything." He picked up his folder and opened it again, and he did not say anything else for the rest of the flight. But I heard what he had said. I turned it over in my mind all the way back to Meridian, and by the time we docked, the word I had pressed down was not a word anymore. It was a decision. 3 weeks later, the documents were released. A source inside the Accord Licensing Board, working through a chain of intermediaries that took investigators 7 years to trace, had extracted 40 years of internal records and pushed them to every major Earth network simultaneously. The release was so coordinated, so complete, that no single government or media authority suppress it fast enough to matter. I read them in my bunk on the station, on a small screen, for 6 hours without stopping. The Accord had never been uncertain about human capability. They had been certain of it. The licensing restrictions were not a cautionary measure applied to a new and unpredictable species. They were a deliberate, sustained, carefully managed ceiling, designed to ensure that human technological development never reached the point where humanity could challenge the existing order of the Accord. Every application Earth had ever submitted to the licensing board had been evaluated not on its merits, but on its threat potential to the dominant bloc. Every approval that had come through had been something harmless. Every rejection had been something that mattered. 40 years. They had known for 40 years what we were capable of, and they had spent 40 years making sure we never got there. The protests began within hours of the release. Not just in one city or one country, but everywhere, simultaneously, in a way that felt less like spontaneous anger and more like something that had been waiting a very long time to be allowed out. People filled streets I had only ever seen pictures of. They filled them in numbers that made the crowds look like water. The Security Council met for 18 hours. I know because Price was in that room, and he sent me a single message just before he went in. "Stay close to your comm." When he came out, he found me in the corridor outside the chamber. He looked tired in a way I had not seen before, a deep tiredness that went past the body. But his eyes were clear. "We're withdrawing from the Accord," he said. I looked at him. Formally, with documentation, citing the suppression records, the vote was unanimous. He paused. "All of it. We're done." I thought about the small table at the wall. I thought about the holding bay that smelled like recycled air. I thought about 39 other delegations sitting where we had sat, waiting where we had waited, smiling the way we had smiled. What happens now? I asked. Price looked at the viewport at the end of the corridor. Beyond it, the stars were the same as they had always been, patient and permanent, and completely indifferent to what small creatures decided about each other. That, he said quietly, depends on them. He walked away down the corridor, and I stood there for a moment in the silence of the station, and I did not press the word down this time. I let it stay. Enough. Dr. Yusuf Adeyemi had not slept in 31 hours, and the coffee in his mug had gone cold sometime around midnight, and none of it mattered because the drive was working. He stood in the middle of a room carved out of solid lunar rock, 300 meters below the surface of the moon's far side, and he watched the readout on the main display cycle through its diagnostic sequence for the 4th time that morning, and every number that came back was exactly where he needed it to be. Behind him, his team of 14 people was very carefully trying not to celebrate too loudly, because they had learned over 8 years of working in this facility that Yusuf did not celebrate until he had seen the same result 12 times. He was on number 4. They could wait. "Run it again," he said. His deputy, a woman named Claire Owen, who had been with him since the beginning of the project, and who was, in Yusuf's opinion, the finest materials physicist alive on any world, pulled up the secondary diagnostic without comment and started it from the top. The room around them was called Laboratory 7 on the official internal documentation. The facility it sat inside had no official name, because the facility did not officially exist. On the handful of documents that referred to it in any form, it was listed as a geological survey station, maintaining equipment for long-term tectonic monitoring of the lunar surface. This was a cover story that had never been seriously tested, because no one from the Accord had ever requested access, and no one from the Earth government had ever felt the need to explain what was really down there. What was really down there was Project Nightforge. Yusuf had been recruited 14 years ago, when he was 32, and teaching advanced propulsion theory at a university in Nairobi, and had, in a paper that he published without fully understanding its implications, described a theoretical framework for modifying Accord standard drive architecture in a way that would fundamentally change how the core interacted with local space-time. The paper was read by a lot of people. Most of them were other academics. 2 of them were not. Those 2 people had come to his office on a Thursday afternoon and asked him if he would like to continue his research somewhere with significantly better equipment and significantly fewer questions. He had said yes, and he had never quite gone back to the life he had before. Nightforge was not a single project. It was a collection of 23 parallel research programs, each working on a different piece of the same fundamental problem. How do you take technology that was designed by species who have been flying between stars for 300 years and make it better? The answer, Yusuf had come to understand, was that you do not try to replicate it. You study it until you understand not just what it does, but why it does it, and then you set it aside, and you build something of your own. The Accord had given humanity just enough technology to be dependent on it. The licensing restrictions meant that every drive humanity used, every sensor array, every communication system, ran on hardware purchased from Accord suppliers at prices that kept the supply lines firmly in Accord hands. If the Accord decided tomorrow to stop selling Earth replacement parts, the Defense Force would begin losing operational capacity within 8 months, and would be effectively grounded within 3 years. That was not an accident. Yusuf had understood that long before the documents were released. What he had not fully understood until he began working at Nightforge was how long humanity had understood it too. The Shroud Drive was the project he had been brought in to lead. Its name was simple. Its function was not. Every Accord vessel that moved through space produced a specific signature, a particular interaction between its drive core and local space-time that was as distinctive, to the right sensors, as a fingerprint. Accord detection systems were built around reading those signatures. They were extremely good at it. They had to be, because the technology was so standardized across species that the signatures were all variations on the same basic pattern. Human vessels produced the same signatures because human vessels used the same technology. What Yusuf had spent 8 years building was a drive that produced no signature at all. Not a reduced signature, not a masked one. The shroud drive did not hide the ship. It fundamentally changed the way the ship's core interacted with space-time, so that there was nothing to detect. It was a different kind of engine entirely. One that moved through space the way a fish moves through water, rather than the way a boat sits on top of it. The Accord had built their detection systems around a door. Yusuf had built something that went through the wall. Diagnostic complete, Claire said. All values nominal. Variance within acceptable range across all 14 parameters. Start it again, Yusuf said. The door at the back of the room opened, and Director Catherine Marsh walked in. She ran Nightforge at the administrative level, which meant she dealt with the parts of the operation that Yusuf was constitutionally unsuited for: logistics, supply chains, personnel security, and the ongoing performance of not existing. She was 55, and she had spent her career in intelligence before coming to Nightforge, and she moved with the particular economy of motion that Yusuf associated with people who had spent a long time being careful. "You've heard," she said. "The documents? Yes. And the Security Council vote." He turned to look at her. "We're withdrawing?" "Unanimous. Formal notice goes out in 6 hours." The room was very quiet. One of the junior technicians said something softly that Yusuf did not catch, and the person next to her put a hand briefly on her shoulder. Yusuf looked back at the display. The diagnostic was cycling again, patient and methodical, checking everything for the 5th time. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Our analysts say the Velarath will dispatch a compliance fleet within 2 weeks of the formal notice, possibly sooner." Marsh walked up beside him. "They will not take the withdrawal seriously. They have never had a member species withdraw before. They don't have a framework for what to do when a species says no, because no species has ever said no." "Then they're about to build one," Yusuf said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the numbers come back clean. All 14 parameters. Everything exactly where it needed to be. "We have 214 ships," he said. 216, as of this morning. The last 2 came online at Waystation Bravo, at 0400. 216 ships. Built over 28 years in facilities that did not officially exist, crewed by people who had maintained operational silence with a discipline that still, even now, struck Yusuf as close to remarkable. Every vessel assembled from materials sourced through channels that had no connection to Accord supply lines. Every drive built to Nightforge specifications rather than Accord standard. Every sensor array, every communication system, every piece of equipment down to the navigation terminals, designed and manufactured by human hands working from human understanding. The Accord had looked at humanity and seen a species that needed to be managed. They had never considered the possibility that, while they were managing, humanity was watching them very closely and learning things they were not meant to learn. "The shroud drive is ready," Yusuf said. "All field tests are complete. The installation on the fleet is, I assume, already done." "Finished 2 months ago." He nodded. He picked up his cold coffee and looked at it for a moment, then set it back down. "They gave us their technology," he said, "and they told us that was all we needed. They thought that was a leash." He paused. "They didn't understand what we are." Marsh looked at him. "We're the species that looked at the wheel," Yusuf said, "and invented the engine. We don't stop at what we're given." "No," she said, "we never have." Claire looked up from her station. "Diagnostic 5 complete. All parameters nominal." "Start it again," Yusuf said, and then, after a moment, "Actually no, we're done." He turned to face the room, to the 14 people who had been with him through 8 years of work in a facility carved out of rock on the dark side of the moon. "We're done," he said again. "It's ready. All of it is ready." No one cheered. There was a particular kind of silence that sometimes settles over a group of people in the moment, just before something enormous begins, and it was that silence that came down over Laboratory 7 now. Heavy and still, and charged with a significance that no one quite had words for yet. "How long," Yusuf asked quietly, "before the Velarath fleet arrives?" "At their standard patrol speed," Marsh said. 11 days after they depart." He nodded slowly. He thought about all of it. 8 years in this room, and the 20 years of work that came before it, and the 40 years before that, of humans sitting in waiting rooms and small tables and holding bays that smelled like recycled air. "Tell the fleet commanders," he said, "that the drive is green. They can move to staging positions." He picked up his cold coffee one more time, and this time he drank it, and it tasted, he thought, like something ending, and like something else, something he didn't quite have a name for yet, beginning. Commander Riku Tanaka was 38 years old, and he had spent the last 4 years living on a ship that did not officially exist, in a staging area that was not on any Accord chart, commanding a crew of 312 people who had signed agreements so thorough that their own families did not know where they were. He did not think of this as a sacrifice. He thought of it as a decision, made clearly and with full information, to do the thing that needed doing. The ship he commanded was called the Dawn Meridian, which was the name his crew had given her, because official naming conventions did not apply to things that did not officially exist. She was 800 meters long, and she was the most capable vessel humanity had ever built, and she had been sitting dark and cold in the asteroid belt for 14 months, while her crew ran drills and maintenance cycles and, quietly, waited. The order that came through on day 9 of the 11-day window was exactly one sentence long. "Move to formation. Staging complete." Riku read it twice. Then he put it down and walked to the bridge, and his crew looked at him when he came in, and he said, "Bring her up." The Dawn Meridian came to life around him. He had watched recordings of Accord military vessels powering up, and they were impressive in a particular way. All clean lines and precise energy signatures and the kind of efficiency that came from centuries of refinement. His ship coming up felt different. It felt like something waking up from a long, intentional sleep, like a thing that had been patient and was now done being patient. Comms from Fleet, his navigation officer, a young man named Peter Cole, reported. "All 216 vessels are active, formation holding at staging. 216 ships, strung out through the asteroid belt like a hidden constellation, every single one of them running on drives that left no trace on any sensor in the Accord's arsenal. To the Velarath compliance fleet currently making its way toward Earth's solar system, the asteroid belt was empty. To every scanning system they ran, there was nothing out there but rock and ice and the slow turning of the outer solar system. They did not know. They could not know. That was the whole point." Riku stood at the forward display and watched the positional data come in. The Accord fleet was 11 ships. It had grown since the initial intelligence assessment, because the Velarath had apparently received the formal withdrawal notice and decided that 11 ships was enough to make the point they wanted to make. They were not wrong that 11 ships was, by any normal calculation, more than sufficient to bring a single reluctant species back into compliance. Normal calculations had never involved humanity. "Time to Earth orbit?" Riku asked. "At current approach speed, 47 minutes, Peter said. "Open fleet comm, all ships." The channel opened. He could feel, in the particular quality of the silence that followed, 215 crews across the belt waiting. "You know what this is," Riku said. "You've known what it was since you came aboard. We are not going out there to start something. We are going out there to finish something that started 40 years ago, when humanity decided to be patient." He paused. "Patience served its purpose. We learned everything we needed to learn. We built everything we needed to build. The Accord looked at us and decided we were manageable. They're about to find out what we actually are." He looked at the display, at the slow dot of the approaching Accord fleet. "We do this clean. We do it right. And we do it once. Move to intercept. Shroud active." The fleet moved. 216 ships, each running silent in a way that no technology in the Accord's arsenal could detect, spread through space in a formation that had been planned and rehearsed and adjusted over 14 months of drills in the dark of the asteroid belt. They moved fast. Not in a line, not in a block, but in a pattern that would have looked, to anyone watching with the right sensors, like a vast net drawing itself closed. The Velarath compliance fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel just inside the orbit of Mars, exactly where fleet intelligence had predicted they would. They came in confidently, spread in a standard patrol formation, their sensors sweeping and finding nothing but the expected background of a quiet solar system, with no military capability worth noting. Fleet Admiral Goran Thresh commanded the Velarath force from his flagship. He was, by all accounts, an experienced commander. He had conducted 3 compliance operations in his career, against 2 different species, and all 3 had gone smoothly. You arrived. You broadcast the terms. The species in question, staring at 11 warships, reconsidered their position. Negotiations resumed. Everyone went home. He broadcast the terms now. Return to Accord membership. Renounce the withdrawal. Accept a period of supervised governance while the situation was reviewed. Failure to comply within 1 hour would result in appropriate measures. He received no response. This was unusual. He gave it 7 minutes. Then he broadcast again, adding that the lack of response was noted and would be reflected in the terms when compliance was eventually achieved. He received no response. On the dawn meridian, Riku watched the clock. He had planned this precisely, not to be dramatic, but because timing mattered, and the specific timing of what came next mattered most of all. Formation confirm, he said. The answers came back across the fleet channel in sequence, one after another, calm and professional. Every ship in position, every drive green, every crew at stations. Drop shroud, Riku said. All ships, simultaneous. 216 ships appeared in space. Not in front of the Velarath formation. Not to the sides or above or below, in positions that might have looked threatening in a conventional way. They appeared inside the formation, between ships, around ships, so close in some cases that the Velarath vessels would have been reading human hull markings on their external cameras. The intercept pattern had been designed specifically so that not a single Accord vessel had a clean line of fire to any other Accord vessel without a human ship sitting in the way. It was not a battle position. It was something else entirely. It was a demonstration, precise and controlled and completely without aggression, of exactly what the situation was. On the Velarath flagship, the sensor readings that came in had to be processed 3 times before anyone believed them. The emergency alerts triggered across the fleet simultaneously. 216 contacts, inside the formation, from nowhere, with no warning, no approach signature, no possible explanation under the current understanding of how space travel worked. In the stunned silence that followed on every Accord bridge, Riku's voice came across the open channel, unhurried and clear. Accord Fleet. This is Commander Riku Tanaka of the Earth Defense Force. You are in Earth's solar system without invitation. We are asking you, once, to leave. He paused for exactly 3 seconds. You have 5 minutes. We will not repeat this. He closed the channel and waited. On the Velarath flagship, Fleet Admiral Thresh was looking at his tactical display and experiencing something that did not have a precise name in Velarath military doctrine, because Velarath military doctrine had not historically needed a term for it. What he was experiencing was the recognition that every assumption he had brought into this system was wrong, and that the wrong assumptions were of a fundamental enough nature that no amount of tactical adjustment was going to fix them. 216 ships, from nothing, inside his formation. He sent a priority query to his scientific officer. The answer that came back was that the human vessels appeared to be generating no drive signature of any kind, and that the science officer had no explanation for this, and was suggesting they revisit the question in a less immediate context. 3 minutes passed. 2 of the Accord ships, at the far edge of the formation, where their captains had apparently decided that action was preferable to paralysis, brought their weapons systems online. Peter Cole, on the Dawn Meridian's bridge, said quietly, 2 contacts going active, sir. Far formation, bearing 7-3 and 9-1. Riku watched them on the display. He let the numbers come in. Drive active, weapons charged, targeting systems searching. Engage, he said. The 2 Accord ships were removed from the engagement in less than 3 seconds. Not destroyed in a dramatic way, simply stopped, precisely and completely, by weapons that struck faster and more accurately than anything in the Accord's technical experience suggested was possible. The ships were not, for what it was worth, annihilated. They were disabled, hulls intact enough to be recoverable. Riku had been specific about that in the operational orders. There was a difference between demonstrating capability and being careless, and he intended to stay on the right side of it. The remaining 9 Accord ships did not go active. For 11 seconds, nothing moved. Riku counted them. Then, in a sequence that lasted less than 90 seconds, all 9 Accord vessels went to emergency drive and jumped. Not in formation, not with any coordination. Each ship picked its own vector and ran, because 11 seconds of looking at 216 human ships from inside their formation, after watching 2 of their own go dark in 3 seconds, had apparently produced a consensus among 9 separate crews that the value of this particular compliance mission was not worth investigating further. The solar system was quiet again. Riku stood at his display and looked at the space where an Accord fleet had been, and he felt something settle in his chest. Not triumph, something quieter and more durable than triumph. Something that felt like a long conversation finally, after a very long time, getting to its honest point. "Comms to Earth," he said. "Tell them it's done." Peter was already typing. "And the Accord ships, sir? The disabled too?" "Send a medical team. Make sure the crews are stable. Then tow them to a position outside our system, and leave them there." He paused. "Leave them supplies." Peter looked up from his console. "We're not them," Riku said simply. He walked to the viewport, and looked out at the asteroid belt, at the ordinary-looking dark of space that had hidden 216 ships for over a year. The stars beyond it were the same as they had always been. He had grown up looking at those stars, the same way every human being who had ever lived had looked at them, with that particular mixture of wonder and longing that seemed to be built into the species at a level deeper than language. They were still there. They had not changed. Everything else had. The Accord's response to what its sensor networks recorded as the Battle of Mars approach took 72 hours to arrive, not because the Accord was slow to act, but because the Accord spent the first 60 of those hours attempting to explain to itself what had actually happened. Sergeant Mara Voss watched the debates on the public Accord broadcast channels from her bunk on Sol Station Meridian, and thought that she had never before watched an interstellar governing body experience genuine confusion in real time. It was oddly human, she thought. Confusion was something she recognized. The Accord's position hardened in the ways that positions tend to harden when the people holding them are unwilling to update their fundamental understanding of a situation. The humans had developed unauthorized technology. The humans had demonstrated that technology in a provocative and unlawful manner. The humans had refused a lawful compliance order and responded with aggression. These were violations of the Accord Charter and would be treated accordingly. This position required the Accord to not engage with the more difficult part of the story, which was that 2 Accord warships were currently sitting disabled in Earth's outer system, with their crews alive and treated and supplied, and that 11 Accord ships had run from a confrontation that a 216-ship force had chosen not to escalate into anything more than a demonstration. Mara read the official statements and thought about the holding bay that smelled like recycled air. She thought about the small table at the wall. She thought about Ambassador Price smoothing that piece of paper with his thumb. Not angry, not frustrated, just exhausted. She thought about what it had taken. Not the technology. The technology was extraordinary, and she was still absorbing the fact of it. The 28 years of work underground and in the dark. The fleet in the asteroid belt. Yusuf Adeyemi and his team building something in a carved-out room under the moon's far side. But the technology was a product of the real thing. The real thing was what it had taken for an entire species to decide, quietly and over decades, that being managed was not the same as being cared for, and that patience was not the same as acceptance, and that the smile you wore to get through a room full of people who did not respect you was not, in the end, who you were. She filed a request for transfer to active fleet service that afternoon. It was approved the next morning. The official Accord War Declaration came in, 48 hours later, signed by 7 of the 11 member species, and delivered in the formal language of the Accord Charter, which was precise and long and, in its way, impressive. It cited the unauthorized technology development, the destruction of Accord military assets, the violation of compliance protocols, and the fundamental threat that humanity's actions pose to the stability of the Accord as reasons for the collective military response that would be forthcoming. It was a serious document. It carried the weight of an institution that had governed interstellar relations for 3 centuries. Earth's response was 4 lines long. "We have read your declaration. We understand your position. Our position remains unchanged. We are ready. The war, such as it was, had a shape that became clear only in retrospect. The way most things that matter become clear only after you have lived through them. At the time, living through it felt like a series of individual moments, each one complete in itself, each one sitting between what came before and what came after, without much concern for how it would look in a history. Mara came to understand this later. At the time, she was in it. Her fleet assignment took her to the heavy cruiser Constance, part of the 3rd Perimeter Group operating along the outer edge of what the fleet called the Sole Defensive Shell, a network of positioning points and patrol corridors that the fleet had established around Earth's system in the first weeks after the Compliance Fleet's retreat. The Constance was not a frontline ship. Her job was watch and relay, maintaining sensor coverage, and serving as a communication node for the broader fleet network. It was not glamorous work. It was also, Mara came to understand, the kind of work that mattered most. The Accord's coalition fleet was assembling at Keth Station, which sat at the edge of a minor system 7 light-years from Earth. Intelligence assets, none of which Mara was cleared to know the specifics of, were producing a steady stream of information about the coalition's composition and disposition. 600 ships, eventually. It grew by the week as the 7 signatory species contributed forces, and 3 of the non-signatory species observed and considered. 600 ships was a number that, in any previous context of human military experience, would have been cause for a particular kind of conversation about acceptable losses and strategic objectives and exit conditions. The fleet commanders did not appear to be having that conversation. They appeared, from what Mara could observe at her level of the operational structure, to be having a very different kind of conversation. One that started with the recognition that 600 ships pointed at Earth was a problem not of numbers but of strategy, and that the solution to a numbers problem and the solution to a strategy problem were entirely different things. Earth did not intend to defend Earth. That was the part that took Mara a while to understand. The Sole Defensive Shell was real, and the Constance was genuinely part of it, but the shell was not the plan. The shell was the part of the plan that looked like a plan to people who were looking for a conventional military posture. It was designed to be seen and understood as such. The actual plan was something else, and it was already in motion before the Accord coalition finished assembling. Commander Riku Tanaka, she learned later, had spent the 11 days between the Compliance Fleet incident and the war declaration writing a document called the Asymmetry Study. It was not a battle plan in the traditional sense. It was an analysis of 40 years of Accord military operations, reviewed and cross-referenced against everything Earth's intelligence networks had assembled about how the Accord actually fought, how it sustained itself logistically, how its communication systems worked, and where the points were that, if you pressed them correctly, would cause the whole interconnected structure to start coming apart. The Accord was a coalition of many species, which meant its military coordination depended on shared infrastructure, relay stations, supply depots, communication hubs. Each one was individually defended, but none of them were defended against a force that could arrive without warning, achieve its objective quickly, and depart before a response could be organized. None of them had been designed to be. There had never been a species in the Accord's history that could appear from nowhere, and so the possibility had never been seriously fortified against. The Ghost Fleet could appear from anywhere. The operations began quietly, in the second week after the war declaration, with 3 simultaneous strikes against Accord relay stations in the systems adjacent to Keth. The stations were not military targets in a traditional sense. They were communication infrastructure, and the strikes against them were precise and focused on systems rather than personnel, conducted by small fast units that were in and out before any response could form. The crews of the stations were not harmed. Their equipment was made temporarily inoperable. The effect on the Accord coalition's communication with its command structure was significant. Not devastating, not immediately, but significant in the way that a small cut can become significant if it is in exactly the right place. Mara heard about the operations through the fleet network, in the clipped and unemotional language of operational updates, and she thought about the strategy she had been reading and what passed for her off time. The Accord's strength was its coordination, and its coordination lived in its infrastructure, and its infrastructure was not designed for an enemy that moved like this. The Accord tried to respond. 3 times in the first month, Accord forces moved toward positions where human units had last been detected, and 3 times, by the time they arrived, there was nothing there. The Shroud Drive was not something you could plan around if you did not know it existed, and even now that the Accord knew it existed, knowing it existed and being able to counter it were very different problems. The coalition began to fracture in the 6th week. Not dramatically, not with public announcements or formal withdrawals. It started with 2 of the 3 non-signatory observer species quietly informing the Accord Council that they had reviewed the operational data and had concluded that their interests did not require active participation in the coalition at this time. Then one of the 7 signatory species, a relatively small participant called the Meth-Ul, formally withdrew from the coalition, citing the ongoing damage to the relay infrastructure as a threat to their own trade routes that they could not accept as a cost of the operation. The Accord's response to the Meth-Ul withdrawal was, by all accounts, not well received by the Meth-Ul. By the 8th week, 3 more species had withdrawn or significantly reduced their coalition contribution. The 600-ship fleet that had assembled at Keth Station was now 430 ships, and it was getting less coordinated by the week, and its commanders were working from the growing understanding that the plan they had started with, which was to use overwhelming force to establish compliance, required knowing where to point that force. You cannot point overwhelming force at something that is not where you think it is. Mara served 7 months on the Constance, and in those 7 months she participated in 2 relay operations and 1 communication interdiction, none of which involved direct engagement with Accord forces, and all of which were conducted with the same quiet precision that had become, she realized, the hallmark of how Earth fought. Not loudly, not with the kind of force that history books recorded in terms of dramatic moments and decisive battles, methodically, precisely, against the things that held the other side's strength together. She thought about this sometimes, in the long watches on the Constance, looking out at the stars. She had spent 11 years escorting diplomats through corridors where she was furniture. She had spent 7 months doing work that mattered in ways she was still adding up. The difference was not in what she was doing, she thought. It was in whether the work had an honest purpose. The engagement that history eventually called the Keth Corridor Action was, in retrospect, the moment when the shape of the outcome became clear. It was not a battle. It was a decision. The remaining Accord coalition force, now 380 ships operating with significantly degraded communication links and supply chains that were being quietly and consistently disrupted, received intelligence suggesting that a major human fleet element was positioned in the Keth corridor. The intelligence was real. The human fleet element was there. What the intelligence did not convey, because it could not, was that the human fleet element had chosen that position specifically, had spent 2 weeks ensuring it would be detected, and was waiting not to hold a defensive line but to demonstrate something. When the Accord fleet committed to the engagement and arrived in the Keth corridor in strength, what it found was a human force that was, by raw number of ships, considerably smaller. What it also found was that within 3 minutes of the engagement beginning, its own formation had been penetrated in 9 separate places by units that had decloaked inside it. Its communication links had been cut by targeted interdiction against relay points it had not known were being targeted, and its capacity to coordinate as a single force had been reduced to whatever each individual captain could manage with what was visible from their own bridge. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, the Accord coalition had lost 60 ships disabled and 11 destroyed, against 14 human ships disabled and none destroyed. More significantly, the coalition fleet had retreated to Keth Station in a state of disorder that made further coordinated offensive operations effectively impossible with current force levels. The Accord Council convened an emergency session. Mara was on the Constance, running a routine sensor sweep of the Sol shell's outer boundary, when the message came through from Fleet Command. It was brief. It said that Accord representatives had requested a formal communication channel, and that Earth had accepted. It said that all offensive operations were suspended pending the outcome of the communication. It said to maintain positions and wait. She read it twice. Then she went to the small galley at the back of her deck, where several of her crewmates were already gathered around a screen replaying the sensor data from the Keth corridor action, and she poured herself a cup of coffee that was, for once, actually hot, and she sat down, and she let herself feel what she had not let herself feel for 11 years. Not triumph, something quieter, something like the particular relief of a weight that has been carried for a very long time being set down, finally, in the right place. The coffee was good. She drank it slowly. Ambassador Priya Nair had been in diplomacy for 22 years, and she had been patient for most of them, and she was done being patient, and it showed. Not in a loud way, not in any way that anyone in the room could have pointed to and described as aggressive or unreasonable. It showed in the clarity of her posture, in the way she set her folder on the table of the main chamber of Sol Station Meridian and opened it without ceremony, in the way she looked across at the Velarath high speaker and waited for him to finish adjusting himself in his seat before she began. She had been given this seat, the chair at the center of the main table, not a small table at the wall, the center. She had noted it when she walked in, quietly and without expression, and she had sat down, and she had not commented on it, because commenting on it would have given it more weight than it deserved, and what it deserved was exactly this, to be the obvious and unremarkable thing it should always have been. The Velarath high speaker was named Gull Thresh. He was not the same individual who had led the compliance fleet, which had been a different Thresh, a coincidence of Velarath family naming conventions that Priya had looked up and confirmed before the session began, because she was the kind of person who confirmed things before sessions began. He was senior, experienced, and carrying, she assessed, the particular tension of a person who was in a room they did not previously expect to be in, under circumstances they did not expect to have arrived at. Ambassador Nair, he said. His translator unit rendered his voice into something close to a neutral human tone. We are here to discuss a path forward. Yes, Priya said. We are. The Accord regrets the escalation of recent events, and is prepared to consider arrangements that reflect the current situation. Priya looked at him. I have Earth's terms, she said. I would like to present them now. A brief pause. Of course. She had written these terms herself, with input from a working group that included Colin Price, who had spent the last 8 months quietly not gloating about anything, which was, she thought, one of his finest qualities. The terms were not punitive. They were not designed to humiliate. They were designed to produce an outcome that was stable and honest, and that Earth could actually live inside for the next several generations. Full membership in the Accord. Not provisional, not supervised, not conditional on ongoing review. Full membership, with the same voting rights and council access as any other species of comparable presence. Open access to faster-than-light technology, no licensing board, no approval process. Humans could develop, manufacture, and trade technology on the same terms as anyone else. Formal reparations for 40 years of deliberate suppression. The amount was specific, and had been calculated by an economic team that had spent 3 months reviewing the documents released by the original source, and arriving at a number that was, Priya felt, quite conservative given the actual damage done. A binding non-interference clause. No species, Accord member or otherwise, would take any action designed to limit, suppress, or redirect the technological or economic development of any other species without the explicit consent of that species and the approval of the full Accord Council. And one final term, which Priya had added herself, and which the working group had debated for 2 days before agreeing to include. A formal acknowledgement, entered into the Accord's permanent record, that the actions of the past 40 years had constituted a systematic violation of the principles the Accord claimed to represent, and that this acknowledgement was not a condition of negotiation, but a precondition of any agreement. Without it, there was no path forward. With it, there was. She read all of it aloud, clearly and without emphasis, the way she read everything when it mattered. Gull Thresh listened. Several of the other representatives around the table listened. There was a long silence when she finished. Some of these terms, Gull Thresh said carefully, will require internal consultation. Of course, Priya said. You have 72 hours. Another pause. The reparations figure is correct. The non-interference clause is quite broad. It is designed to be. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression, she thought, that she had not seen in Velorath faces before. Not in 11 years of reading them across tables where she did not have a chair. She tried to name it, and eventually arrived at something close to recalculation. "We will review the terms," he said. "I know you will," she said. He poured 2 cups of something that was not quite wine but was in the family of beverages that served similar social purposes across a great many species, and he pushed one across the table toward her, and she accepted it, and they sat for a moment in a silence that was, she thought, not entirely uncomfortable. "Your technology," he said, "the drive system. How long has it existed?" "That's not part of the current discussion." "No," he agreed. "I know." He looked at his cup. "We made assumptions." "Yes," Priya said, "you did." She did not elaborate, because she did not need to, and because one of the things she had learned in 22 years of diplomacy was that the moment when the other side arrived at its own understanding of what had happened was more durable than any lecture she could have offered. People believe what they figure out for themselves in a way they never quite believe what they are told. She let him sit with it. The 72 hours passed. The Accord Council met in full session, including the 4 species that had withdrawn from the coalition, and 2 that had never joined it. The meeting lasted 11 hours. Then Goldthresh contacted her through the official channel, and said that the council had reviewed Earth's terms. She came back to the table. He had the agreement document ready. Every term was in it. The reparations figure, the non-interference clause, the full membership provision, and the acknowledgement, entered at the front of the document before anything else, clear and permanent and specific. He signed it first, then the other representatives, then Priya. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, looking at the signed document, something much more like completion. The sense of a thing that had been left unfinished for a very long time, finally being brought to its proper end. One thing happened after the signing, that she had not planned and had not expected, and that she thought about often afterward. Among the observers permitted in the chamber for the signing was a Keth IV military officer, a member of the Accord species that had occupied that world and whose forces had engaged with human Marines during the corridor operations. He was there in an advisory capacity for his government, which had been one of the earlier coalition withdrawals. He was tall, with the particular coloring of his species, and he moved carefully in the way of someone who had been recently injured and was managing it. He waited until the room was nearly empty, and then he approached Priya and asked, through his translator, if he could speak with her. She said yes. "I was taken," he said. "During the Keth operation. My unit was taken." He paused. "Your soldiers. They were—" He searched for the word. "Careful. That was the instruction," Priya said. "They gave us medical care," he said, "before they returned us, before they knew whether the negotiations would happen." He was quiet for a moment. "I asked my government why we had joined the coalition. I asked what we had been afraid of." He looked at her steadily. They did not have a good answer. Priya looked at him and thought about something she had been carrying for a long time, which was the knowledge that the things that made humanity most human were also the things that the Accord had most profoundly failed to understand. Not the engineering, not the patience or the strategy or the capability that had been built in the dark over 28 years. Those were impressive, and they mattered, but they were not the thing. The thing was the medical team on the way to a disabled Accord ship. It was the supplies left for crews that had just tried to compel compliance by force. It was Colin Price smoothing a piece of paper with his thumb and saying 15 delegations without anger. Just fact. It was the understanding that the people on the other side of a conflict were still people, and that how you treated them in the moments when you did not have to be careful said more about you than anything else you would ever do. "I'm glad your unit was returned safely," Priya said to the Keth IV officer. "I hope you go home." "I am going home," he said. "Tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment longer. "I think my government will not join another coalition like this one." He paused. "I think many governments will not. That," Priya said quietly, "is the point." He left, and she stood alone in the chamber for a moment, with the signed agreement on the table in front of her, and the great curved space of the room empty around her, and the pale Accord lighting coming down the way it always came down, clean and impersonal, and nothing like any light she had ever loved. She thought about Mara Voss, who was still out there on the Constance running sensor sweeps, and whose transfer request she had read about and thought was exactly right. She thought about Yusuf Adeyemi, who was probably already thinking about what came next, because that was who he was. She thought about Riku Tanaka, who had told his crew that they were not going to be what the Accord had been, and had meant it, and had made it true. She thought about Colin Price, 61 years old, smoothing a piece of paper in a waiting room. She closed her folder and picked up her bag and walked out of the chamber and down the long corridor of Seoul Station Meridian, past the windows that looked out on the stars, past the docking bays and the administrative offices and the small galley where, 11 years ago, she had eaten a meal that tasted like nothing because she had been too tired and too ground down to taste anything. Mara Voss was waiting for her in the corridor outside. She was in a Fleet Marine uniform now, not the escort corps dress. She was standing straight the way she always stood, and she was not smiling. Priya had read enough of Mara's service record to know that the not smiling was new. Or rather, that it was old. That the smile had been the new thing, the thing added and maintained and worn through 11 years, because it was what the work required, and that the face she was looking at now was the one that had always been underneath it. "How did it go?" Mara asked. "They signed everything," Priya said. Mara nodded slowly. She looked out the window at the stars for a moment. "Good," she said. "Just the one word, quietly. The way you say something when it is the whole truth, and nothing else needs to be added to it." They walked together down the corridor toward the docking bay, and the station was busy around them, full of the sounds of people working and moving and doing the 1,000 ordinary things that fill a life between the moments that history eventually names. The stars were outside, the same as they had always been, patient and enormous and waiting. Everything else, Priya thought, was different now. Not because they had won something, though they had, not because the agreement was signed, though it was, but because the thing that had been decided 40 years ago, and 10 years ago, and 1 year ago, and in every waiting room and small table and holding bay and underground laboratory along the way, was done being decided, and was now simply true. They were done being managed. They were done being patient. They were done being what someone else had decided they should be. The door to the docking bay opened, and the light from the bay was warmer and less perfect than the Accord light in the corridor behind them, and Priya walked through it, and it felt, she thought, exactly like coming home.